Hello, John Hoffs here to present part two of my story, Growing Up in Hollywood. When I ended part one, I was discussing my memory of the Kennedy assassination. I was 5 years old, almost 6, since it happened November 23rd, if I'm not mistaken. My birthday was a month. My 6th birthday would have been a month and two days later. And we had also moved to a 2-story Spanish-style house built in the 1930s in Brentwood. And that actually is a good place to start talking about how Hollywood is obviously synonymous with the movie business. And my first memories of the people that lived in our neighborhood, which was a very nice, at the time, considered upper middle class neighborhood, not super fancy first class like Beverly Hills or Bel Air. Now I think that's changed and it's in the same league as Beverly Hills and Bel Air. But then we actually had a little bit of an inferiority complex to Beverly Hills, if you can believe that. Because as I said before, the closer you are to the ocean, the better. And that's why Santa Monica is so highly regarded. It's on the ocean. But back then, Santa Monica was really not the Santa Monica it is today, but that's a whole nother story. Getting back to my early years in Brentwood, there were several actors and actresses that lived within blocks of our house. Probably the most famous, well, certainly the most famous in our immediate neighborhood, which was called Brentwood Park, was Gregory Peck. And he lived on Cliffwood, and that was, let me see, we lived on Avondale, and just east of Avondale was Burlingame. After that was Bristol, and after that was Cliffwood. So what is that? Burlingame, Bristol, 3 blocks away lived Gregory Peck. Now, in Brentwood, there had been a lot of stars that had lived there in the 40s, 30s and 40s, who ended up moving to greener pastures to the east, such as Beverly Hills and Bel Air. But back then, Henry Fonda, Judy Garland, Shirley Temple, Gary Cooper, Jimmy Stewart, they all lived in our neighborhood. But somehow they, I guess, got too successful for our neighborhood as it was in those years. We still had Gregory Peck, and we also had people such as, now these are names you may not know, but character actor Richard Jekyll lived 2 blocks away. And on our block, Robert Morse, or Bobby Morse as he was called, he lived about 3 houses away. And the Beatles came to a party that was held on our street 1 block from our house at the corner of Avondale and Evanston. And that's a very famous event in my life. Another early experience was driving by this huge party with cars up and down the street and just a madhouse. And it was a weekend, we were out on some kind of outing as a family, and when we drove by it, we the kids, me, my younger brothers, my younger sister, and my parents, we were pretty amazed that this was happening in our neighborhood. It wasn't until the next day or so that we found out it was the Beatles. You can actually watch that on YouTube, the Beatles party. It's in two parts, and it was because it was covered by the news. The mayor came, Mayor Sam Yorty, and it was a big deal. Well, Beverly Garland lived in our neighborhood. Helen Reddy moved in the 70s. I Am Woman had made her a big star. And let's see. I'm trying to think of any others that come to my mind. Norman Lear and his family lived just another block from our house. Not even a block. Well, it was a block, but a very short block. So there were these, neighbors that, were in the movie business or were famous, whatever. But those ones weren't really that famous, except Gregory Peck, of course. Well, north of Sunset, where famously O.J. Simpson lived in the 80s and 90s, there were a lot of celebrities. The biggest, up on Oakmont, I believe it was the street, was Steve McQueen. And my family actually were friends. My parents, that is, were friends with Steve McQueen and his wife Nell, or Nellie, as she was sometimes called, McQueen. I don't have any memories of meeting McQueen, but I do have a memory of meeting the woman that succeeded Nell McQueen when Steve and she got divorced, and that was none other than Ally McGraw, made famous from her huge success in the movie Love Story, which was around 1969 or 70. And then my mother, who had been an artist and had attended Yale Art School, where she met my father, who was attending Yale Medical School at the time, gave up on her art because she couldn't sell any of her paintings. They just wouldn't sell. So she switched art forms from painting and sculpture to writing. And she chose what else but screenwriting as her medium. And she had written a screenplay in the early 70s called Fly Away Home. That title was later used for some other movie, but this was an original title at the time that she created, and it was about a young woman and her. I never actually read the script. I may have, but I don't remember having read it. But it was a very contemporary drama about a young woman and her romantic life and her parental relationships and difficulties. And anyway, it got my mother a lot of attention. And so that's why Ally McGraw comes into the picture. I do remember seeing her, not McQueen, as I said before, but McGraw, because she came over to our house to have a meeting with my mother in the living room. She sat Indian style, on the floor. It was kind of cool. She was a very beautiful woman. She was very put down by some of the critics for being a poor actress, but she was still a huge star. And, you can never really trust the people that say somebody's a bad actress. I mean, they're like, for example, Rock Hudson, I remember just coincidentally, hearing the person that was most instrumental for my mother's uh, entree into the movie business with her screenplay Fly Away Home, a man named Richard Wilson, once making the remark that the movie Seconds, which I was a big fan of at that time because it was so scary and creepy, and it starred Rock Hudson, and I remember Wilson saying, "Oh, it's a terrible movie," because of Rock Hudson can't act, that type of thing. But to me, he seemed like a good actor. Um, and if I backtrack a little bit, I think that would be the way to proceed. I'm going to backtrack to my first actual friendships with people in the movie business. So back around, 63, 62, I think it was before we moved to Brentwood. And I mentioned in part one, I was attending a nursery school called Village Preschool. And one of my friends, classmates, was a boy named Adam Nimoy. And his father was none other, of course, than Leonard Nimoy. Leonard was just a character actor. He was, this was several years before Star Trek. And he did a lot of work on television. He'd actually been the star of a movie when he was like 19 years old or something. He came out to Hollywood and was cast in a low-budget feature about a boxer named Kid Maroney. And he starred in it. But then he I guess, floundered in his career. I don't know. I can't characterize it as floundered, but he was not famous. So the story goes that my mother would be waiting for me to come out of the preschool at the assigned time, and in the car next to her was Leonard Nimoy waiting for his son to come out because he was not working, and whatever routine he had worked out with his wife, Sandy, made it that it was his job to pick up his kids. So anyway, we became very good friends with the Nimoy family through that encounter. Meanwhile, a couple several months later, probably, or within a year, my sister, Susanna, Susie she was called, or Sue, I call her Sue, was 1 year younger than me. And so, yes, certainly it had to have been later in the year 1963, because that's when we moved to Brentwood. And so she was attending a nursery school in Brentwood on Sunset Boulevard called the Sunshine School. And in similar fashion to me meeting Nimoy, she met Liz Gazzara. And Liz Gazzara was the daughter of Ben Gazzara and Janice Rule. Ben, and through that, let me say, my parents became very good friends with the Gazzaras. I think better friends with the Gazzaras than the Nimoys, really. And Ben Gazzara was currently starring, or I don't know, he not in '63, but probably about '65-ish. He was in a hit television show called Run for Your Life, about a man that is told by his doctor that he has about a year to live. And so he goes on adventures and meets women, and it was a very popular show. And it's funny that they said he was only going to live for a year because that kind of limited the number of seasons they could have. But because of the success of the season one, they decided to have the doctor give him another year. So he had, 2 years to live, and the show went on for a second season. Janice Rule was an accomplished actress in her own right. She was less of a star than him, but she had been in movies like Bell, Book and Candle with Jimmy Stewart and Kim Novak, where she played Jimmy Stewart's girlfriend. She was in the movie The Chase, directed by Arthur Penn, that starred Brando and Robert Redford and an all-star cast. And she was also in a movie called Invitation to a Gunfighter, which connects us now back full circle to Richard Wilson. So who was Richard Wilson? He was someone that played a huge part in my childhood as a friend of my parents, and later I went to work for him as an assistant. Richard Wilson directed Janice Rule and the star of the movie George Siegel, in one of his early roles as a leading man. Yul Brynner was the other star of Invitation to a Gunfighter. And let me just throw this out real fast so I won't forget, and I'm going to come to it later, is that one of the small parts in the movie was played by a man named John Alonzo, who later quit acting and learned how to become a cinematographer and went on to be the DP of Chinatown, one of the most beautifully shot films ever made, in my opinion. Well, Janice recommended my mother's script to Dick Wilson. He loved it, and he wanted to become attached to it, and he wanted to produce and direct it, at least direct it, because he was a director. He wasn't just any director. He was Dick Wilson. Now, that name is probably completely unfamiliar to most people, and unfortunately, his au revoir as a director never met the potential it had, given the fact that he had spent many, many years as the greatest filmmaker in America of all time, or in the world of all time, in my opinion, Orson Welles. Richard Wilson was born in Denver, Colorado. I don't know a whole lot about his early years, but I do know that when Welles was running the Mercury Theater, when he did War of the Worlds, when he did Kane, Ambersons, all the way up through Lady from Shanghai, Dick Wilson was his assistant, I can't think of a better word. I was going to say Boy Friday. He was his associate. And in the scene in Citizen Kane, after the newsreel opening of about the death of Kane, Wilson is one of the reporters that is sitting around in the projection room trying to figure out what Rosebud meant. So he's actually in Citizen Kane, very briefly. Well, when he decided to go out on his own and break away from Welles, he had a string of movies in the 50s and 60s. Probably the most prominent of them was Capone. I want to say Rod Steiger played the part of Capone, but I can't quite remember. He did a movie called Pay or Die with Ernest Borgnine, another sort of crime drama. And he did a very hip movie in the late 60s, in the era of, the counterculture and the hippies and the rock and roll and psychedelia, all of that. he wrote and produced and directed a movie for American International called Three in the Attic, which was, at the time, the highest grossing movie that AIP, American International Pictures, had ever released. It was starred Christopher Jones, who was sort of thought of as a second James Dean. You know, there was a bunch of new James Deans running around, like Michael Parks was another one who had that status. So with Three in the Attic kind of being his calling card, it would be the last movie he'd ever made. So my mother's movie was going to be his next picture. So the Wilsons became probably the best friends of my parents. They were an older couple than my parents. They almost were like mentors to my parents. Not so much my father, who was a prominent psychoanalyst and had big stars that I never could know because of the confidentiality, but he treated many people in the movie business, heads of studios, governors, former governors, that's not movie business, but very prominent people, an ex-congressperson, producers, directors, actors. And as I had said in part one, that psychoanalysis was something that drew actors to help them in their careers and help them in their acting. And it seems like a puzzle as all these pieces are kind of coming together, because Janice Rule, who would then, after I mentioned Invitation to a Gunfighter, she was in one of the Dean Martin, Matt Helm movies, but one of her last roles in a feature was, may have been her last role, was in the great Robert Altman's Three Women, which was made in the mid-'70s, and it starred Sissy Spacek and Shelley Duvall, who were two of the biggest actresses of that period. So that was quite an honor and a testament to her talent that Altman cast her to be one of the co-equal stars with Spacek and Duvall. So Richard Wilson was a very good raconteur. He would tell stories about Orson Welles and about Hollywood and the golden age of Hollywood, and Orson Welles' relationship with Rita Hayworth, and all kinds of interesting Hollywood lore from a man who had been there. And what happened was the script was never made, sadly. But my parents remained friends with the Wilsons until each of them passed away in the 80s or 90s. And when I worked for Dick Wilson, I would do transcriptions of his television work. He never actually produced another. He never did any television. So I correct myself saying that about his television work. He always thought features were the only true measure for a filmmaker, measure of importance. And he shunned television. So I think that's a good place to stop for part two of growing up in Hollywood. when I come back in part 3, I think the story will get even more interesting. So until then, this is John Hoff saying, what is it that I always say at the end? Au revoir.